Good morning. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you all to our online symposium on global crisis, awareness, literacy, and political communication. The event is jointly organized by the Center for Comparative Politics and Media Research at Bournemouth University and the Greek market research and communications company About People. Given the current situation of continuous crisis across the world, we believe that this symposium is so much timely and needed. The confluence of crisis is like nothing we have experienced before outside of wartime, and it seems that most governments have been unable to communicate efficiently with their public. Against this backdrop, there is an urgent need for effective leadership and for citizens and their leaders to come together to achieve collective goals. Drawing on the COVID-19 pandemic and the environmental crisis that have hit the world hard, this symposium aims to reflect and discuss solutions to these challenges. At the core of today's discussion, there are issues touching upon the need for a well-informed citizenry, the role of media, political leadership, and effective modes of political communication. The format of today's discussions will be based on some initial observations and presentations from our speakers, and we will then continue with questions. Finally, on behalf of Bournemouth University, I would like to thank About People for their excellent collaboration in organizing this event. Special thanks goes to Antigoni Kotanidis and Petros Ioannidis. And I would also like to thank our distinguished speakers and our moderators, as well as News 24/7 for covering this event. And now I hand it over to Petros Ioannidis, the CEO of About People. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. I also want to welcome you here today and to thank everyone involved in the organization of this event, Bournemouth University, our team at About People, and of course, News 24/7 for covering the event. As Anastasia said, we consider that this discussion is very much needed given what is going on, the pandemic and the environmental crisis, let's say. We are very pleased to have the chance to discuss with a stellar lineup of speakers and our moderators, Mr. Panagopoulos and Mr. Papagiannakis, Andreas and Lefteris, to be easier. Our event has two panels. The first one draws on political communication, the role of state, health and governmental communication. And the second one focuses on the environmental crisis and communication. Without further ado, Andreas will now introduce the speakers of our first panel. Thank you very much and enjoy the event.
Thank you, Anastasia and Petros. I'm honored to moderate this, the first session of this international online symposium. The first session has to do with political public communication and global crisis. And Professor Darren Lyricker will be with us. Also, Professor Dimitris Papadimitriou, Professor Anna Feigermann, and Yorgos Petroulakis. I would like to welcome first Professor Darren Lyricker. Professor Lyricker is Professor in Political Communication in the Faculty of Media and Communication in Bournemouth University and Governor of the Center for Comparative Politics and Media Research. His expertise is in the intersecting areas of political campaigning and public engagement in politics, with a particular focus on the impacts of digital technological developments. He's author of two books. The first one is Political Communication and Cognition, and the second one is The Psychology of Democracy. And he's editor of the Palgrave series, Political Communication and Campaigning. He's going to give us a small lecture, and the title is The Deepening Crisis of Public Communication and How the Crisis Can Be Abated. So, Professor Lyricker, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where we are. Just get my slides up. Excellent. So what I thought I'd do as the, I guess the opening speaker is set a little bit of context in some of these issues, and particularly drawing on some work I've done in relation to the pandemic and communication around the pandemic. So we seem to have gone through 2 decades of crises, and these crises are all overlapping and affecting one another. For some countries, the rise of global terrorism, the economic collapse that dealt blow to many countries, the the rise of nationalism, national protectionism, all the way to Brexit, which has affected the European Union, and of course, most recently, the pandemic. And all of these have contributed to heightened levels of public anxiety and mistrust of institutions. And in particular, with some of these, it's also increased the inequalities within society. And so, as we've seen during the pandemic, some of those who have the most fragile existences, both globally, but also within countries where they have fragile working conditions, economic uncertainty, they have been affected the most. So increasing the sense of crisis that's affecting people and their personal anxiety. And it's also led to polarization within societies, which can be on the sort of the various sort of simplistic things like different positions on the taking a vaccination, but also those bigger political issues about how the economy and how the state should be run. So-called culture wars as well fit into a lot of these things. So all these crises seem to be coming together and mutually feeding one another over this period of time. Now, these link into a broader crisis that we've seen identified over many years in political communication. It's been increasingly professionalized and marketized, and governments have moved into almost sort of permanent campaigning mode constantly in a way to manage the impressions people have of them and to try and reach an audience. So using many technologies to try and reach this sort of fragmented audience that no longer sit down and watch a news program, but maybe pick up news from Facebook, Twitter, etc., but in very small bites. And so to reach those people, political communication has increasingly become more akin to emotional manipulation. It tries to speak to how people feel as opposed to informing people directly. The problem with that is people often feel like they're being manipulated, and they feel that they're constantly being persuaded, but don't always feel that they have the information to make up their mind on the issue over which they're being persuaded. And that also links to the simplistic messaging that politicians tend to use, particularly politicians in government, where they're simply trying to drive people's choices and behaviors in a certain direction, and often driving them more towards supporting a particular party or government than actually informing them and allowing them to have a conversation about policy. And emotional manipulation often leads to the creation of these sort of zero-sum choices, that one is the only right choice, the other is a bad choice, labeling things as socialism or fascism, using these sort of very grand but emotional terms without any real meaning, which forces people to make a choice and to link that choice with their identity. Who are we as a nation? Those kinds of questions that become central to politics at the current time. And all of these further seem to drive public anxiety, insecurity, and in particular mistrust of governments and the general elites, and this othering, we the people versus the state, the elites, all those people who run the economy, is becoming quite prevalent in many societies. So when we were looking at the issues around the communication during the COVID-19 pandemic, it gave a great opportunity to look across a number of nations and not only identify what they were doing wrong, which often was quite a simple process, but look at also what was being done right and how communication should be done in a time of crisis. And working together with Anastasia on a chapter, we came up with 3 elements that we argue should be at the heart of crisis communication and really at the heart of political communication generally. Firstly, and something that seems to be lacking in terms of public perceptions, is that politicians are there to serve the people. And so having a service ethos, which is both rhetorical, so it's explained how politicians are serving the people, but also reflected in the practice of politics, how the policies directly affect people and how people experience politics and political outcomes. They need to see this as something that serves them directly. Excuse me. And so, more authentic policy linking in more to communities and greater accountability and perhaps participation at local level, where there is a political and public partnership over things, as opposed to politicians doing things to people with the claim that it's for people, but people not recognizing that it actually benefits them. Also, we find that there's a lack of inclusivity often, and what social psychologists often call we-ness. This idea of building a single community which all people feel that they belong to and are represented within. So a politics for all that reduces marginalization, everybody within a nation together, and focusing on the different needs of different people, reducing inequalities, for example. And ensuring there's both information and participation routes that are equally accessible to all people within a society. And the final aspect we look at is empathy. And we're not talking here about the kind of the populist claims to be of the people, but a more authentic leadership of the people. So people recognizing that the person in power making decisions understands them and is able to serve them directly. And that true understanding of the people, which can be demonstrated by, knowing the actual cost of a pint of milk, but all the way through understanding the different concerns and issues that people face on a daily basis. And this is something that then, in particular, with the one-size-fits-all style of pandemic communication, has proved highly problematic in gaining compliance across all sections of society. So what we argue for is a democracy for crises and not a democracy in crisis. So feeling at the moment that democracy is in crisis, people do not trust politicians, people do not always believe politicians, and there's a rise of anti-democratic tendencies in terms of seeking the kind of the populist authoritarian styles. So if politics has more of a service ethos, is more inclusive and more empathetic, and we argue citizens should feel better represented and better served. So that feeling of being represented that seems to be missing within societies. There should also be within that ways in which citizens have a voice. So they feel that their representatives are authentic to the societies which they represent, that they feel that they are speaking on behalf of the people, not to the people and trying to persuade them or manipulate them. And that includes the sections of society which often are most likely to feel excluded or marginalized, which can be migrant communities, but it can also be people who are at the poorer end of society, whose jobs are insecure, whose livelihoods are under threat. And that feeling of representation should go into those sections of society, particularly because they're the ones that often feel the most distant from representative democracy. And so decision-making would need to have a more both horizontal but also vertical partnerships, that this reduces the amount of power that people in decision-making roles have, because they need to consult people and people in equal groups, and also linking into various community groups. So having that sense that people can participate and can have a voice. And so politics needs to be combative. It needs to be competitive. It needs to have different positions. It needs to be agonistic, to coin Mouffe's phrase, but not antagonistic, oppositional for the sake of being in opposition, not polarizing. And we argue that if these elements are pulled back into politics or pulled into politics, if they were ever in there to start with, we will find a politics that is able to better link into the lives of ordinary people. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lyricker, for your insightful presentation. And now the stage, the screen, will be for Professor Dimitris Papadimitriou from the University of Manchester. Professor Dimitris Papadimitriou is Professor of Politics at the University of Manchester and Director of the Manchester Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence. He has previously held visiting posts at Princeton, at the London School of Economics, the Yale University. He is a leading scholar of Greek politics and public policy. His last book, Prime Ministers in Greece, The Paradox of Power, with Kevin Featherstone, which is, Professor Featherstone is well known for the Greek public also, was published by Oxford University Press in 2015. He has also published widely on political leadership, policy narratives, European political economy, particularly on the Eurozone crisis, and the EU's external relations. The title of his presentation is International Crisis and the Political Contract, Enrichment, Redefinement, or Degeneration. And he's going to focus on the Eurozone crisis, the migration, environmental crisis, and the COVID-19 crisis. Professor Papadimitriou, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and thank you also to Anastasia and Petros for the invitation. I think that I'm very pleased with what I've heard so far. I think my presentation fits quite well with what Darren has already touched upon. I mean, the opening point here is to state that the crisis that we have all mentioned have very different points of departure, of course, different causes, but all of them, in my opinion, share a number of characteristics, not only on how they came about, but certainly on what we can do to mitigate their negative externalities, if you like. And I'll focus on three brief points here as an introductory opening statement. The first is to say that all crises that we've already touched upon point to an ambivalence in many ways over the limit of national sovereignty. What do I mean by this? That if you look at how the financial crisis in the late 2000s, how it developed, of course, as the Eurozone crisis later on, point to two polar opposites in some ways. On one hand, we have the emergence of economic nationalism. Trumpism in the United States is perhaps a very good example of this, but not only in the United States. We see similar developments in India, probably in China as well. But on the other hand, we also see the emergence of a significant supranational activism in dealing with this financial crisis. I guess, and most relevant to Greece here, is the adjustment programs, the context of the Eurozone crisis, how international players have collaborated to impose adjustment programs, to intervene, in other words, on the national context, to prevent national problems acquiring systemic characteristics. So two different strategies here, none of them perfect, both of them with a lot of problems associated with them. Economic nationalism on one hand, supranational activism on the other. And in many ways, the same conundrum, the same problem of where the boundary of national sovereignty lies is also very evident on the ongoing migration crisis in the Mediterranean, in Europe, but also in other places of the world, where again the securitization of the movement of people, flee, persecution, war, the effects of climate change is very often seen in the national context as a threat to national sovereignty, and therefore as a problem that necessitates heavily securitized approaches to dealing with it. So, first point to mention here, the ambivalence of the limits, if you like, of national sovereignty. But there's a second element that is worth keeping in mind here, also relating to ambivalence, and this time dealing more on the limits of state intervention in economic affairs, but also in social affairs. I mean, again, looking back at the Eurozone crisis earlier on, a big discussion on the politics of the bailouts, on whether national governments should really nationalize private debt, be it losses for the banking sector, or even losses accumulated at the level of households. So a big debate here on whether the state should intervene to mitigate these crises. I mean, we see again one polar extreme of these, which was the way in which the Bush administration in the United States dealt with the Lehman Brothers collapse, where the state sit back and did very little to mitigate it. Long term, of course, the consequences were extremely severe. On the other opposite, on the opposite side, we see the significant intervention, state intervention in rescuing, in inverted commas, the economy in the Eurozone crisis. So again, the state there mobilized a lot more. Although still, and it's worth remembering this, who pays for this intervention, be it for the Eurozone crisis or now for the pandemic, is still quite unclear, and we can come back to that in our discussion. The state has also made, in a way, a bit of a comeback in the context of the COVID crisis as well, not least because in many countries around the world, in the United States this time included, we've seen massive economic stimulus programs to deal with the effects of the pandemic. So very much, if you want to put a label to it, a more Keynesian approach to dealing with this problem, but also the state acquiring a very central part in dealing with the pandemic, in how national health systems have been mobilized to deal with the pandemic. So there is a very strong presence both on the economy and on the social side of things. And as I said earlier, the state seems to be making a very strong comeback. Now, of course, in the case of the pandemic, we're still at an early stage, in the sense that we know that states have borrowed very heavily to mitigate the economic effects of the pandemic, but we don't yet know, again, who's going to pay for it. And in political terms, that is very substantial. In other words, are we going to see increased taxation? Probably. Who is going to get taxed? Is it going to be middle classes? Is it going to be the super rich? We don't know. And who pays for this makes a huge difference. Now, of course, cutting across, and I'm coming to my third point here, all of this crisis is an element of wealth redistribution, because austerity, economic, the collapse of economic activity during the pandemic hits people in different ways. Darren has already mentioned that already. Not everybody suffers the effects equally. We are not in this together in economic sense, right? Some people pay a much heavier price than others. And again, how the dealing of this crisis will lead us in terms of wealth distribution is not at all clear. It's not at all clear domestically. There are some evidence that inequalities, of course, are rising, but it's, I think, too early to say, particularly for the pandemic. But there is, of course, in all of this, another layer of wealth redistribution, which is not so much vertical, but it's more horizontal, and it has to do with how wealth patterns of wealth are shifting away from the West onto the East. The economic rise of China, of India, and other places are complicating matters more nowadays. So again, when we're talking about wealth redistribution, we shouldn't only necessarily think of it as an issue affecting the Western developed economies only, but also the global system as a whole, and which areas of our planet nowadays tend to produce most of these wealth. What does that mean, in a way? What these 3 points mean for our discussion here? I guess, in a very broad sense, what we're talking about here is the redefinition of certain social contracts that have been embedded in our societies, certainly since the Second World War. Darren has already mentioned how people feel disenfranchised and alienated from the political system. Therefore, their support to the system becomes increasingly conditional, increasingly uncertain, and of course, their electoral behavior becomes a lot more volatile. And we have seen this many places in Europe, but not only in Europe. But there is another layer of renegotiation of established norms that has to do more with the international system, and I guess a question mark here on whether in the decades to come, in the years and perhaps decades to come, the established pattern of multilateralism and international cooperation of one way or another in dealing with problems will continue to be the dominant paradigm. I mean, there are evidence to suggest that our world is becoming less multilateral, more bilateral. What does that mean for the future of liberal norms in international relations and liberal institutions in international relations is to be seen. For us living in the European Union, for some of you living in the European Union, again, the future of multilateralism is a very important thing to keep in mind, because the European Union was built on that principle. It has propagated this principle in international politics for good reasons, in my opinion. But there are other things emerging too. And speaking to you from West Yorkshire in Brexit land, I can tell you that multilateralism is not necessarily the dominant paradigm here. And therefore, where we are going to end up a few years down the line is not entirely clear. So on that very optimistic point, I'll keep quiet and happy to answer any questions that may come later on.
Thank you, Professor Papadimitriou, for your presentation, which covered more aspects about the issue we're talking about. And now Professor Anna Feigermann, which is a researcher and teacher based in Bournemouth University in the UK, is going to join us. She's the principal investigator of the AHRC COVID-19 Rapid Response Project, which is about comics in the time of COVID-19. She's author of the Data Storytelling Workbook and regularly trains health and humanitarian organizations in data-based and digital communication. So, she's going to show us a great job she's doing there about how we can communicate using comics and how the comics can be used in the communication era. So the title of her presentation is Communicating with Comics in Times of Crisis. And Professor Feigermann, the screen is yours.
Thank you. So good morning. Thank you for having me. Kalimera, Kalispera. Excuse my pronunciation. Those are two of my favorite Greek words that I remember from my last visit, which was sadly 20 years ago now. So I'm not sure if my slides are on the screen yet. There they go. Okay, so I'm going to take you through some highlights from our AHOC rapid response project, which means they gave us very little time to produce a lot of data. And so that is what I'm going to kind of run you through. So this is something that we've done basically in real time as the pandemic has been happening. So these are also quite nascent lessons and things that are, of course, still unfolding as we enter another major wave of the pandemic. Okay. So first to say, I have a wonderful and brilliant and very large project team, which is what even made this possible, including stakeholder partners from Information Literacy Group, Graphic Medicine, Public Health Dorset, and the Comics Grid. So this was really a collaboration between public health experts, information literacy experts, and comic scholars and experts that were already working at the intersections of graphic medicine, which is healthcare, and comics or graphic arts mediums. And a number of RAs, all alumni from our wonderful master's programs, both one that Darren helped and then Anastasia helped establish, and one that I was involved in establishing at our university. So you'll see these little avatars appear in the parts of the presentation that they contributed to the findings for in specific. So this project began as we started to see in our own social media feeds a number of comics that were trying to tackle major issues in the pandemic. These ranged from what we might think of as sort of a very kind of comic style approach to basic public health information. And so here we see the hero's journey narrative being applied to the idea of wearing masks, as well as some of the deeper, more mental health, more emotional well-being issues that began to arise, particularly in relation to lockdowns, to the loss of economic income, and the other kinds of austerity that came with the pandemic, as we've heard a bit about in the opening presentations. And so we had these kind of public health guidance, and we had this mental health and wellness being addressed in comics. And then we also started to see these deeper forms of comics that were trying to address these larger issues of health equity, of the ways that governments were responding and more often failing to respond to the crisis. And we saw a call come out for this rapid response grants, and we thought, you know what, we really want to be collecting and archiving this, particularly because social media is so commodified. We ended up using Instagram, right? So metaverse, Zuckerberg empire. And these platforms are really not useful for cultural archiving or for heritage preservation. And they tend to extract that value that artists put into it rather than to return that value to society. And so we also wanted to create a project methodology that would allow us to garner what was valuable for the social good from this ephemeral forms of commodified media platforms and repurpose them for public good and public use. And so a lot of the methodology of this project can be applied elsewhere and is about the way that we figure out what positive things social media can do as communication channels and what people are actually doing on them that is not only about spreading misinformation, but often about trying to counter misinformation and form community. And so this is intentionally a recuration project that was looking for good practice, not just analyzing what was being talked about or said. And so there were two main components of this project. One was to get these comics off of Instagram for analysis and for the recuration of a searchable database that health communicators could use in order to look at examples of best practice. And I'll drop the links into the comments if that's working later. So the database is now online, so you can search it yourself. And as well as a best practice guide and a final report. Those are also the best practice guide is up online, and I'll put a link into the report when I'm done speaking, so you can see the finality of all of this. So we read 15,000 comics online, and 3,000 of those were identified as containing public health messages, thinking of public health broadly to also include mental health and wellness. And so I'm going to run through in the remainder of this presentation some of the highlights from our findings there as they relate to this event. So our first set of findings had to do with comics and how they can humanize public health messages. And so this is a little bit of a sideways take on some of the things that Darren was talking about in the first presentation. And so we were actually quite interested in how artists deal with this question of inattentive economies. How are they using emotion to talk about public health? And how are they creating simplistic messages that actually might have much deeper meanings? So approaching some of these issues of social media that can be very challenging for wanting political communication to happen at a higher level. But at the same time, you know, this is the reality of one of the major communication forms we have. So how do we think about what best practice using some of these arising tools and techniques might look like? So let's see if this one's going to go. So this is our first kind of major finding, which has to do with how comics can build empathy. And one of the major ways that comics as a medium is useful for the creation of empathy around public health is because it does something that comic scholars call showing the use of inner worlds. It's one of the only mediums that's able to capture so quickly and simplistically that what we say and what we might show on the outside can be very different than what we're feeling and what we're going through on the inside, which is, of course, absolutely crucial for acknowledging and communicating about public health, particularly in times of chaos and uncertainty and complexity. And so this is one of the major things that we think comics can contribute to public health communication. So another thing linked to this that comics can do is just provide a platform for mental health, in part because of this ability. And again, we're seeing it here in this comic example from Corona Diaries, who is a major advocate in the UK for the acknowledgement and change being called for people with long COVID. And so it's this ability to show that emotion, to actually visualize the symptoms in a way that, you know, a pictogram of a thermometer, you know, or someone sneezing with a tissue with a hand over its nose cannot get at that emotional layer that we need in order to, one, understand the invisible aspects of mental health crises, and two, to be able to have that empathy by actually having a human connection to what someone is going through. So this is something that we really saw, and it was after public health guidelines, the second most common issue addressed in these comics was mental health and well-being. Another things that comics are really good for, particularly info comics, and there's a long history of comics being used for science communication and medical communication, is their ability to use visual metaphor in order to make things more relatable, to come to life for readers, and that kind of, you know, hitting into that part, so those parts of storytelling that are just deeply human. And so we saw this use of visual metaphor probably most often in our sample when it was actually visualizing the virus itself. A lot of this kind of turning the virus into a villain, as we're seeing in this comic, or turning it into kind of a monster in this one. And so this is a collaboration between science communicators and a comics artist, where that was made for children in order to try and explain what was going on with the virus. We also saw a lot of this kind of magnification of the virus, so the ability to visualize something microscopic and make it known in more information-based comics that were doing things like explaining how variants happen, how do mutations form. And these have been incredibly useful tools for science communication. In fact, the most highly circulated and commented upon, or the most engaged with comic in our sample came from an artist called Weimankow, who is well known for spreading information about how hand washing and hand sanitizer and mask wearing actually worked on a kind of scientific level. Another thing that comics can do is to help us visualize issues of health equity. Of course, when we talk about these quite complex, layered forms of health issues. So why is it that the Black and ethnic minority communities are seeing much higher rates of COVID? How do we understand, the reason that we need to be safe or careful ourselves is because we actually come in contact with lots of vulnerable people. Of course, now we're in the kind of compassion fatigue era of the pandemic. And so these are comics that were addressing kind of an earlier stage where people were just trying to conceptualize and make sense of what was going on. So this is a comic by Mona Chalabi, who is well known for her kind of artistic data visualizations and that appear in newspapers. She's actually a British Science, nominated as a British or awarded a British Science Fellowship for her work during the pandemic to make these kinds of issues visual. And so this was a really nice way of sort of showing what it meant to be in contact with people, and how these kinds of our sense of our bubble is actually much larger than what they actually are. And lots of her other work does the same kind of health equity function. So our second set of findings, and the last one I'll go through, is that comics can challenge misinformation. And going back to what I said earlier and reflecting on some of the stuff that Darren was saying here, and Demetrius a little bit, is that we know and we think of social media as being the spreader of disinformation and misinformation, which it is, of course, very much is. And research on that and regulation on that is very, very important. So the other thing that our project was interested in is how might we think about ways to flood social media with information with things that challenge misinformation, with evidence-based communication. So how might we also think of these channels as things that we could be using in much more effective ways in these forms of challenge? So I'm going to go through just a few things on this here. So one of the things that we think there needs to be much more of a culture of practice around, and we saw in only 5% of the sample that we studied, however, those 5% were also some of the most liked and engaged with comics. So there is definitely a hunger for this kind of visual media that is also using forms of scientific, of referencing of information, but kind of best practice in information literacy. And so we were looking at different kinds of visual referencing strategies that are possible. Of course, Instagram is a terrible platform for links. You know, they claim that it is to stop spam, but I think it's much more to have control over the marketplace. That is Instagram. And so you're only allowed one link in your bio on Instagram. And so it's very difficult to actually have credible sourcing happen when you have a platform that denies the ability to have links. So some of the things we need to think about when we're thinking about how we stop the spread of spam online, or when we stop the spread of disinformation, is to make sure that we aren't also crushing the ability to send evidence-based information, that we aren't also crushing the ability for science communicators to become authoritative and influential voices online. And so this is something that we were quite interested in. One of the other things that's quite powerful that comics can do is to help create literacy around scientific uncertainty. Of course, one of the hardest things as a communicator, whether a government communicator or a science communicator or journalist during this crisis, has been the amount of uncertainty. And so to even talk about case numbers, to even talk about R numbers, you had to first try and establish a sense of data literacy amongst your audience for concepts that many people had no idea even existed. The idea of projections and multiple competing projections is incredibly complicated and not something that most people who haven't encountered a sort of a serious health crisis themselves have necessarily ever had to deal with on this scale. And so there's a lot of literacy work that needs to be done around even being able to communicate around uncertainty. And studies are beginning to show that the public is actually willing to accept a lot more scientific uncertainty than was previously thought. And it actually can create trust in this landscape of political mistrust if we are honest about uncertainty. And I think we are going to see a change in the language of scientific uncertainty emerge from the already changing practices that we've had during COVID-19. This is from a beautiful comic by a health administrator who was in charge of counting the COVID statistics during the pandemic, and probably still is, about the complexity of doing that. Okay, so I will finish there for today. There are, of course, many other findings, and you can read about them in our report.
Thank you, Professor Feigenbaum. I believe that your presentation and the comics idea of communicating might find some followers here in Greece, which is a topic not very well, distributed in our country. Right now, I would like to invite Yorgos Petroulakis, which is former General Secretary of Information and Communication in Greece. I believe many of the audience will know him. And dear George, you're going to speak about the government communication, and the screen is yours. And I know that after your speech, you have to leave us, and we won't have the chance to have you with us answering questions or commenting what the the audience might like to ask you. Thank you.
I'm really sorry. Good morning from downtown Athens. I would also like to thank the always forward-looking Center for Comparative Politics and Media Research of Bournemouth University, and About People, the leading Greek public opinion research company, for their kind invitation to participate in this symposium. I would say that personally, I had my fair share of crisis, serving as Secretary General of Information and Communication of the Greek government between 2009 and 2012, at the outbreak and the first peak of the Greek and the European financial crisis. But also being a citizen of a country, Greece, that in fact, it has been at the front line of consecutive crises for over now a decade. Financial crisis, refugee crisis, and now, of course, the pandemic that has left no one untouched around the globe. There are really many things to say about the overwhelming challenges this online event reflects upon. I know time is precious, so I would like to offer my personal input on two of the main issues addressed by this symposium. First, how do we ensure government communication follows best practices in times of crisis? And second, how do we ensure that political and public communication performs to reflect service ethos, is inclusive and empathic? In fact, the previous speakers, the professors, really covered many of my thoughts on these issues. So I would like to add 2 points. The first one, let me start by saying that an inherent characteristic of every single crisis is unpredictability, okay? A high level of unpredictability. They can't be predicted. And even if someone can see it coming, or some people can see it coming, nobody can really be sure about the volume of its impact. I remember back in 2009, many people were talking about Greece's financial instability, but nobody could even imagine a Eurozone-wide financial crisis that would shake up the whole EU establishment for over 6 years. In any case, in every single crisis, the level of our collective response cannot be other than dramatically inferior to what we're dealing with. Okay, that's what creates a crisis. So my point here is that given the unpredictability factor, the best way to ensure that government communication follows best practices and is ethical, inclusive, and empathic in times of crisis is to do and be so before the crisis and regardless of the crisis. I mean, let's face it, when everything is collapsing, when everything falls apart, during a crisis, you can't expect a government to learn how to be empathic and inclusive in its communication if it wasn't before. It's as simple as that. So this is why, for example, numerous studies so far and many to come concerning the pandemic will almost certainly come to the same conclusion, which is that well-organized or fairly well-functioning democracies before the coronavirus crisis did grosso modo better than poorly functioning democracies. But how can a government communicate with empathy and inclusiveness during a crisis? That's my second point. The key here for me, and the most crucial thing, is leading by example. I mean, everybody knows that with or without a crisis, communication means nothing without policy content. And that's 100 times more so during a crisis. Because that's when all the spotlights fall on the head of the government, inevitably, all right? That's when leadership is mostly needed. So the target here is to quickly formulate policies and a communication strategy that will make every single citizen feel part of a collective effort, of a national effort. Because there's a golden rule for me that applies to while addressing the consequences of a crisis. The more involved, the merrier. The more people are engaged in tackling a crisis, the better the outcome. So, how can a leader inspire this? How can he inspire or she inspire a national effort? What's the best practice? And the best practice here is leading by example, which means first, apply policies and rules with impartiality. There will be uncertainty, but you have to be impartial in what you're imposing. Second, be the first to follow the rules you ask society to obey. And third, be strict on anyone breaking the rules, especially yourself and your own people. What I mean here is that during a crisis, with every single word, every single deed, a leader needs to communicate that his or her mind is firmly and exclusively set on the common good. Not the votes, not the next elections, but the well-being of the society as a whole. And that's how you build trust. That's how you generate comfort in people's worried minds. That's the kind of communication needed. Thank you very much for your attention and your time. Unfortunately, Andreas, I won't be able to participate in the upcoming discussion, but it has been an honor and a pleasure to participate in this symposium with such distinguished speakers.
Dear George, thank you very much. It was very useful, your approach, and I wish you a good day. And right now, I would like to have with me the honored distinguished professors to take a few questions we collected from the audience and some issues they came up. And if I may sum up a few key points, Professor Lyricker proposed a new approach for political communication, which in my opinion shouldn't be in discussion. It is what every political institution and subject should apply in their everyday practice. On the other hand, Professor Feigermann proved with the case studies he presented the power of communicating with clear symbol images using comics. And Professor Papadimitriou presented what makes countries, supranational organizations ambivalent and citizens feel insecure. New terms, new words, and issues rise every day, and public opinion needs guidance. In crisis, institutions should be a source of accurate, relevant, and timely information. And the first question is coming from the audience. Do you believe that politicians can change or can change their training and their culture? Are the obstacles to apply an open, honest, inclusive, and clear speech? In other words, do you believe that polarization and ideological monologues feed their existence? Let's start with you, Professor Lyricker.
Okay, well, I suppose in a way it depends on the politician. Some politicians do approach things in a very different way. I suppose, you know, when we look across the last 2 years, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand seemed to have, you know, developed a style of communication, not only during the pandemic, but prior to that, which did bring a nation together, whereas others, and we can have extreme examples like Trump, who are extremely polarizing. I think the Ardern model and style is much closer to what we are suggesting. Unfortunately, she does seem to be something of an outlier. And the problem is for other politicians to realize that the problems that they face in terms of getting people to trust them and to buy into measures is not simply about doing, you know, better, simpler communication, but being trusted as the source. I think that a lot of what Anna was talking about is work that's being done, you know, so within communities, not by the government. And one of the problems is when the government communicates something, they're not always trusted in the same way as somebody outside of government. And I think that's a big problem. I need to realize what's wrong with that. And as George said in the last presentation, you know, in a way, I completely agree with him. I haven't got an assessment of the Greek government's performance during this, but it's having that embedded and thinking, right, how do I communicate in a way that will get people to trust me and follow me and accept my leadership is legitimate? And at the moment, there's many leaders struggling to do that with large sections of the population.
What's your opinion, Professor Papadimitriou?
Thank you. 2 points, really. I think that the first one is to state the obvious, that the electorate and the national political communities, as indeed the international political communities, are increasingly fragmented, right? Mm-hmm. So people, I think it has already been mentioned, receive their information from not uniform places in a way, right? The way in which they access information makes them more partisan, makes them make the range of possible solution to the problems they identify much narrower, and therefore against this increasingly fragmented electorate or political community at home, the question of producing a communication strategy that is unifying is very difficult. But there is a second issue here, because communication is not everything, right? Very often communication reflects institutional and political arrangements each individual country that interfere. So I think that the New Zealand example has been used as a very good approach to the crisis, a very good rhetoric, and a unifying discourse on terrorism, amongst other things. Sure, but New Zealand was a consensual political system beforehand. If you look at countries like Greece or indeed the United Kingdom, where the political discourse and the political institutions that produced that discourse were always a lot more adversarial, you see that the production of these narratives are almost impossible. So before we talk about communication, of course, communication is very important. We also need to see how our political systems, our institutions, our electoral laws conspire in a way to produce consensus and to produce sort of more sensible political outcomes. And Greece was, as I said earlier, a very adversarial, has a very adversarial political culture. This has inevitably got tangled in the communication and in the strategy dealing with the pandemic as well. So let's look at communication, but also let's not forget the subterranean or not so subterranean dynamics in our political systems that produce this polarization.
Okay. So, Professor Feigenbaum, I would like to add to the previous question, if you believe that social media is an asset for the suggested political communication reform, or might be a trap due to the filter bubble, hate speech, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll answer the social media question first, and then just a question on the, or perhaps a question back to Demetrius and Darren on the other points. I think that questioning whether or not social media should be used is like questioning whether or not telephones exist or televisions exist. I think that the fact that we're still even having a debate about whether or not this is a platform we should use completely understands the history of technology and technological adoption. It is here. It is a major channel in people's lives for all kinds of reasons. How it then gets regulated, who owns it, how we use it, the same kinds of questions we ask and have asked in all of history when all new technologies for communication came on board, radio, television, telephones. We need to be asking those questions, and we are, at the policy level. But we can't keep demonizing, and we can't keep acting like the technology itself is the problem. And I think if we look at the history of moral panics around every communication technology that's ever emerged, we will see the same pattern of behavior. And the more time that we spend moralizing, the less energy that we are putting into figuring out how this technology could actually work in the social good. So I think we, by all means, need to be countering hate speech and disinformation and thinking about what is it about these platforms, what is it about the way that they're regulated that enables this. But we also need to be thinking about how do we promote the positive. So there's no reason why we couldn't have a tick system that we use for celebrities that also gets used for credible science and health communicators. There are all sorts of innovations that we could be making that would bolster and amplify evidence-based communication on social media. In relation to the other question, I think one of the things that's been really interesting to me, in part through this study and in part just, as a political citizens kind of spanning the US and the UK at least, is in the US context, and I'm sure this is happening in other countries, is the ways in which the state became more important than the federal. So how much power got devolved on that level. And I wonder if the other political community, the actual kind of political theorists in the room have had reflections on that. And likewise, in thinking about the UK context, so I think this is also true in the US context, the amount of authority that has been handed over to experts, to expert panels, to advisors. And certainly in the UK right now, the way that the media is framing it is like, will the political leaders do the things that the scientists are saying? And I'm wondering if that's being seen on a more global level, and what people might think will come of that, if anything.
Okay, and I've got right now a question, which is, since we are receiving data in bite-sized snippets in this super ephemeral mode, how can we encourage big tech companies like Facebook, Instagram, etc. to collaborate better? Carrot or stick? Do you want to add something, Professor Feigenbaum?
To respond to that?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
And then we move to Dr. Lyricker and Dimitriou.
Okay, so at the moment, the ways that the relationships work between researchers and tech giants is that elite institutions, your Harvards, your Stanfords, your Oxfords, are the ones who are in kind of alliances or contracts. So often universities that are already highly privatized and already have highly business-focused models are the ones who are, not surprisingly, in these kinds of allegiances. So I think what we need to see is more of a devolution of that power. I think we need to see collaborations that aren't reproducing the same kinds of elitism and the same kind of government to my friend who owns an app building business collaborations that we're seeing happening in governments. Otherwise, we're just going to have more mistrust and more being led by profit over people in these public health situations.
Okay. Professor Papadimitriou, do you want to add something? And then Professor Lyricker?
This is not really my area of expertise, but
yes.
Instinctively, I think it needs to be both carrot and sticks, and certainly more and more uniform regulation.
Professor Lyricker, or I have to go on?
And very briefly, I think that there needs to be far more transparency about how social media companies operate, and the linkages between the social media companies and the app producers, and the way a whole range of institutions work. That the big problem is really what it can't be any state that does it. It's very difficult for one state to try and regulate. So really what it needs is the United Nations to regulate social media companies and treat them as a multinational, because nothing else I can see really working, because they are global. You know, their reach isn't into the UK. Their reach is across Africa, across Asia. It's pretty much everywhere. And you either close them off in the way that China tries to do, or you form an agreement with them. And I think that's something that needs to be done, but it needs to be done at the global level, and for countries to get together to do that. But there's a whole range of difficulties involved in that too. So although it's a nice, elegant solution, it's not exactly the easiest solution.
I think that Professor Feigermann said something about the next question. Do you believe that the reform of the way to communicate might affect media practice and journalists if politicians reform their way of communication? Professor Lyricker?
Well, yeah. The problem at the moment with a lot of politics, it is very partisan and very adversarial, and the media has largely picked up on that tone. And of course, it's also competing within the attention economy. It creates stories that get viewers. So conflict, those classical, so shock, horror, murder, and conflict, they're the things that sell newspapers. So scandals become much bigger sometimes than the actual reality is. But I think part of that is the way there is a tenor coming from politics as well that drives that. That when you're within a party and you see the opposition in trouble, and you know that any point that you can score against them is of benefit to you, you will push that to your partisan journalists and your supporters. So that will increase that kind of tenor. And I think what we have to do is retrench a little bit to a position where there is accountability, that governments are held to account, that oppositions are held to account, that truth, is being told by politicians. And when they don't, they're exposed for doing it. But it's not sensationalized, and the tone is calm somewhat. Everything seems to be about sort of making it as the headlines as blaring as possible, the tone to be as dramatic as possible. Does contribute to those problems in terms of public trust and their understanding of politics.
What is your view, Professor Papadimitriou?
If I understood the question correctly, I think that what we see here is very interesting paradox. I don't know the answer to this, but I can point to the paradox, which is that the rise of social media, self-broadcasting, and so on was meant to empower people, to take out barriers to self-expression, to voices being able to reach audiences that they wouldn't otherwise reach in a more centralized media landscape. In many ways, that was a promise of freedom. and therefore a promise for a better quality democracy. But here we are, less than 20 years down the line, and we see that increasingly as a threat to democracy. And we start talking about regulation, better accountability, more sensible debate. I think that Anna was absolutely right before. I think that we shouldn't fall into the trap of demonizing the medium, but equally, we shouldn't really discredit the value of regulation. We should all be clear that this kind of epiphany, or this kind of a promised land of self-expression and unmitigated communication with the world doesn't really work, or it doesn't seem to be working. Now, what you do about it, well, that's Anna's and Darren's field. I have no answer. I can only point to the problem, I'm afraid.
Okay. And Anna, do you have a final comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say, I think the really important thing to remember when we're talking about social media is to always ask who owns the platforms. So the promise of democracy doesn't work if you just have a bunch of giant corporations with incredibly self-interested that are running the landscape, that are increasingly becoming concentrated, and the fact that we aren't able to break that up just using our existing trust legislation is very worrying. And there's no way that you can have democratization of platforms when big platforms can just buy up every small, interesting initiative, that's trying to challenge them. Like, we're in an economic position with platformization and social media that is completely counter to democracy. So you have to address that issue of platforms if you want to have a kind of democratic landscape, just like you have to address any kind of infrastructure or power if you want to change the ways that communication can happen within those infrastructures. And then I guess on the journalism point, something that I'm grappling with and don't have answers for is that I really feel like we can't keep talking about truth without emotion, and we need to have more humanized and empathetic ways of understanding truths, at the same time as we want to be able to counter sensationalism and all the things that Darren was talking about that are problems with journalism, not completely tied to the commodification of journalism. And I don't know how to resolve that. I don't know how to resolve being an advocate for emotional communication and emotional intelligence in the ways that we talk about evidence-based knowledge, at the same time as I want to be critical of sensationalizing and of adversarial politics, which is also, of course, just a masculine set of emotions rather than a more feminine set of emotions. So yeah, so I'm kind of grappling with that, I think, right now.
Okay. Darren, you want to add something? And I think that the time is pressing us, so we have to close our wonderful discussion. I think we could discuss days about those topics.
I was just a quick comment on the emotional element and empathetic communication, really. And I think this is one of the things that's lacking, of governments claiming that this is working, and whatever the policy is, and people at various stages in society are saying, no, it isn't, not for me. And that's where the understanding and where people then look at the politician and say, this is not the truth I recognize. That to the ordinary person in the street, they can say, no, you're lying, it's not working for me. And I think that's where these claims to truth and accuracy, having these very, very simple, broad statements, have a real problem. And I think they've had a real problem during the pandemic, particularly because not everyone has the same experience. Our experience here will have been very, very different to someone who's going out every day to work and facing the public. And our two truths are very different about how the pandemic works, as well as the person who's isn't able to work and is stuck on the sofa watching daytime TV, God help them. So all of those different truths exist out there, and that's where empathy and understanding needs to be embedded in that communication to make it clear that everybody is understood in the society, whatever their situation is.
In this point, I would like to thank you so much. It was a great honor to be here with us, Professor Lyricker, Professor Papadimitriou, Professor Feigermann. I hope that our discussion, the first panel, gave some insights to our audience how to deal with a better political communication, to include all the people in the difficult times we are facing. It was a great honor to have you with us. Thank you very much. And I would like to remind to our audience that the second panel will start 14:30 Greek time, Athens time. And please stay tuned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Welcome back to our conference. This is the second panel on global crisis awareness, literacy, and political communication. We will deal specifically with climate change and the climate crisis. We have a very interesting panel and a number of people that will intervene, and I hope that you will find their interventions very useful and very helpful. So a few words about our panelists first, and I will start the presentation in the order that they will come in and present the topics. So first of all, Miyaza Christensen, she holds a PhD from the University of Texas. She's a professor of media communication studies in Stockholm and an affiliated professor at the Department of Philosophy and History of Technology, Science and Environment, the Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden. She's the director of leading environment in global media studies and politics of mediated communication at the Department of Media Studies at the University of Stockholm. Then we have Jacob Ensco. I apologize for the pronunciation if it's not correct. He is a senior researcher associate at Lancaster Environment Center, where he works on the Climate Citizens Project. His work focuses on the role of public deliberation in responding to the climate emergency. He worked also before joining the University of Lancaster, he worked with UK politicians and policymakers, and he holds a degree in zoology, economics, and human geography, and a PhD in environmental governance from the University of Edinburgh. Then we have Theodota Nantsu. Theodota is the head of programs for WWF Greece, the Worldwide Fund. And let me get my small notes because I lost them. They're on the phone. And she also studied philosophy. And then he holds a master's in environmental ethics and public administration. And her work focuses on policies addressing the climate crisis, nature protection, and governance for sustainable development, and the transition to climate neutrality. Finally, we have with us James Painter. He's a research associate at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, Department of Politics and International Relations at Oxford University. He is a senior teaching associate at the Environmental Change Institute School of Geography, also at Oxford. He has published widely on climate change in the media in several countries, and his current research interests include media portrayals of extreme weather events, animal agriculture, climate change, climate skepticism, and more widely on the challenges of climate journalism. I will give the floor now to Miyaza, who will be presenting journalism, mediation, and the environment, the example from the Arctic, which is an area that has gathered a lot of interest during the past years on what is happening in this area. For Europe, it is a remote area, and not many people know much about this and what is happening. So we will follow your presentation with a great interest. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Let's see how I can share my slides. Let's see. There we are. Yes. Can you hear me okay? Hello?
We seem to experience a bit of technical issues, which is understandable. Let's see, can we try and bring back Miyaza online with her camera and her mic? Or else we will move on to the next one and come back to her again. Let's see, give it a bit of time. Okay, so we will call on our second panelist and we will try to resolve the issue on Miyaza's connection. Okay. So, Jacob Ensco, if you can come in, he will make a presentation on more and better democracy, citizen deliberation as a response to the climate crisis. Jacob, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invite. I am also going to try and share some slides. You have no slides. That's not good. Let's share my screen, see if that works. Share screen, Windows. Right. Is sharing a window. I'm assuming then, I can't see anyone else, but I'm assuming that you can see the slides. Probably should have uploaded them. Cool, I'm going to carry on, and if people can't hear me or can't see the slides, if someone could come online and say something in my ears, that would be useful, but I'm just going to plow on hoping that you can. So I'm Dr. Jacob Ensco. I work at Lancaster University on a project called Climate Citizens, which is looking to embed citizen deliberation in how we respond to the climate crisis. So I think potentially unlike some of the other panelists today, our focus is not so much on kind of engagement and communication around climate change and the impacts of climate change per se, as much as it is about kind of the policy response and what we do about climate change. And I'll have to kind of apologize for the potentially parochial nature of my talk, like this is focused on the UK. In particular, I'm aware this doesn't necessarily translate to all other countries.
Dr. Ensco, I think you're sharing the wrong window. If you might unshare your window and then try that again, we should be able to see the right stream. You may be using multiple monitors and it'll give you a choice to pick the second screen.
No. Right, how about that? Is that
That's
good?
better. That's much better.
So if I do that...
Please go ahead. Yeah. That's right. Perfect. Thank you.
Sorry about that. So anyway, in the UK context anyway, the debate over the science of climate change has largely been what people accept as happening by and large, accept it because of the impact on their lifetime. So the bar at the top here, the dark blue, the light blue taken together, that's kind of concern, public concern, taken government holding data.
Dr. Ensco, I think you might have muted your microphone. Perhaps a setting on your...
Hello?
That's
Hello?
better.
Hello?
Perfect. Perfect.
Right.
Go ahead.
It's not going well so far, is it? Right.
That's all right.
Anyway, so let's speed up a little bit because I'm where I'm eating into my time. The point of this slide is that climate change is now an issue of significant concern within the UK. Not only that, it's increasingly an issue that actually sits towards the top of people's concerns, above things like the economy, the NHS, and Brexit, which is quite remarkable. Historically, people might have said they're concerned about climate change, but they have more proximate, more immediate issues that they'll point to as being at the top of their list. So that's the context we're working with in the UK. But the challenge that we face is that the nature of the doing something about climate change bit, the next step, has changed dramatically in the last few years. So the graph on the left here is emissions from different sectors in the UK economy. And the line to focus on is the red one. So that's emissions from the power sector, so largely energy generation. And that's really done the heavy lifting in the last 2 decades in the UK. Most of our emissions reductions have come from taking coal out of the energy mix and ramping up renewables, and we've done reasonably well at it. But you can do that without many people noticing, short of a few people who get irate about wind turbines. Largely, people don't notice. But if you look then at the blue lines, the third from the top, that turquoisey blue one, and the orange zigzaggy one, so that's surface transport and its buildings. So that's largely people's boilers and their cars. And it's very difficult to do things about those things without people noticing. So we're getting to a point now where the way people live their lives is going to have to fundamentally change really quite rapidly. And it's all very well to say you're concerned about climate change, but that doesn't mean you want someone coming into your house and ripping out your boiler. So that's the sort of situation that we're faced with. And obviously that you can get that wrong. You can get this wrong in a number of different directions. So the picture on the left here is the Extinction Rebellion protests in London in 2019. And that's basically saying you're not going quickly enough, you're not going fast enough, you're not doing enough. On the flip side, there's a picture here of the Gilets jaunes protests in France, which is you've done something and it's awful. It doesn't work. It doesn't work for me. It's exacerbating inequalities. It's making it much harder to live our lives, and it's not fair. There's an excellent kind of slogan from the Gilets jaunes protest, which is that elites think about the end of the world, we think about the end of the week. So you can get it wrong in either direction. I think the potential for this kind of backlash at doing something with getting it wrong is growing. So in the UK, for example, the climate skeptic group have pivoted away from questioning the science and have now started questioning the cost of net zero, and are trying to spin a discourse and a narrative about climate change policy as being this elite project of people coming to take your boilers, and they're coming to take your cars, and they're coming to put your taxes up. And that's the kind of stick that they're using now to try and sort of fight the battle of fighting back progress and climate change. And at the moment, it's not getting much purchase, but in April this year, when massive spike in wholesale energy prices are set to be passed on to consumers in the form of their energy bills, the potential then, I think, when shocks like that hit people's wallets, people who are already struggling, there is clearly the potential for that animosity to be harnessed for a particular political project. So treading this line is difficult. We've got to go quickly, but we've got to do it in a way that works for people, that people support and people can get on board with. And there is this sort of lingering question of, are our democratic institutions up to that task? Democracies typically are quite short-sighted. They typically don't necessarily make the best use of all information available to them, and they can be quite capricious. And there is a sort of train of thought that says, no, democracy can't handle this. We need some sort of kind of technocratic authoritarianism, which has always seemed to me like a little bit, certainly in the context of sort of Western democracies like the UK, for example, always seemed a little bit of a sort of semi-utopian vision. It's not clear to me how we get from where we are to there. So if we want to avoid this backlash, we want to avoid getting it wrong, I think the answer that we put forward anyway is that what we need is more and better democracy. We need institutions that bring people into the policy-making process so that they can see themselves and their concerns and preferences reflected in the way that we go about tackling this challenge. So in that sense, it's been really excellent to see the sort of uptick in the use of mini publics. So for people who aren't familiar with these, a mini public, like a citizens' jury or a citizens' assembly, is a group of lay people, of citizens of a particular country or area, who have been selected to be demographically representative of the macro public that they're there to represent. Typically about 20 people for a jury, up to kind of 100 plus for an assembly. And they will sit and they will hear from experts and they will question experts and they will deliberate amongst themselves and they will come out with some recommendations or suggestions for the policy area that they've been set to work on. And these have been used in different policy areas for a number of years now, but they've really sort of recently, there's been a big focus on using these to address this climate issue, precisely to try and tread this path between moving quickly enough, but moving in a way that doesn't cause a kind of backlash. So we've seen the UK government, the UK Parliament commissioned one recently, the CCC in France commissioned by Macron in direct response to the Gilets jaunes uprisings, the Climate Assembly, the Citizens' Assembly in Ireland, which has been long-standing but has turned its attention recently towards climate change. And also not just at a national level, we've seen a massive upsurge in the use of these things at a local level. And these hold out the potential to kind of A, bring people together, to B, kind of overcome some of the short-sightedness of kind of democratic institutions, and C, to sort of make sure that people's concerns are reflected in policy advice. But the issue is obviously that they're almost exclusively advisory. And some people push for the kind of empowerment of these things, but there are obviously various legitimation concerns that come along with that. But the issue with them being advisory is that you very easily fall into a situation where they're either ignored or elites or people in political power just cherry pick the results that they like and use them to legitimate paths of action that they were going to go down anyway. And these are all issues that people who study mini publics have been aware about for a very long time. But as we look at the impacts of these climate assemblies and these climate juries, these concerns are starting to come to light, and people are sort of recognizing the limitations of these one-off, standalone deliberative processes. So this kind of brings me to what we're working on the Climate Citizens Project, along with many others, which is how do you take that insight that what we need is we need to improve our democratic institutions, we need to bring people into those, and we need to use deliberative practices to make sure we can sort of tread that narrow path I've been talking about, but in a way that moves beyond just kind of standalone one-off mini publics that some people sort of turn to as a bit of a panacea. And I don't have loads of time, so I'm not going to go into loads of details, but a few things I think we're sort of working on and want to point towards is the need to be much more nuanced and sophisticated about how you use mini-publics, and be really precise about what they're for or what any particular one is for, what you want to achieve with it, and make sure it's designed accordingly. And secondly, look at how we can kind of have a wider scale than just a mini-public have and generate a broader societal level debate about the direction of travel on climate policy and opening up the climate policy process more broadly. So just quickly, we're working with the UK government advisory body, the Climate Change Committee, to see how they can use mini-publics basically as an information processing device to bring in those insights from everyday citizens to kind of help inform their advice to government. So it is explicitly advisory, but it plays that information processing role. They can be used as a very good signaling device. If you can get people to kind of know that they've taken place, to sort of understand how they run, and to kind of see their outputs as being representative of what they may well think if they've gone through the same process, they may make an informed decision to almost defer to these mini-publics and use them to update their own priors and inform their own preferences, which will then obviously dictate how they go about engaging with political institutions around them, political parties and voting, etc. But if you want them to do that, if you want a mini-public to play that role, you need to design it to do it. And it needs to have a significantly well-funded and well-structured public engagement campaign that goes on around it so people are aware of it and do understand it. And we've seen that happening to different degrees with the climate assemblies we've seen. And then on open up the policy-making process, I mean, I'll just point to one thing here, which is at the moment, the way that the UK government goes about formally consulting on climate policy is a very kind of opaque and difficult process to engage with if you're not a policy wonk or not a particular interest group who has the time, resources and knowledge to kind of contribute. So we're thinking through different ways you could open up that process to make it more accessible to everyday people to sort of take part in and sort of see their views reflected in. So I'll leave it there. And I guess there's one final thing to say is that this kind of what we're sort of working towards here, yes, it's about the climate crisis, but I think, you know, if we look at the sort of poly crisis the climate crisis sits within, there are many good reasons to be looking again at our democratic institutions and to kind of looking at ways to make them function better. So there is that bigger part of what we're trying to do here. But I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacob. I will keep as remarks the fact that there is a need to make things quicker, but also efficiently and more openly and respect the democratic process. And how do you include more people in this process and not use excuse to exclude others? I mean, it seems like the necessity for speeding up climate adaptation excludes people from the process. And this might be a question to answer later on. And also that this also, if you don't do it in the right way, democracy is in danger in a large extent. I mean, it is a very generic discussion, but it seems that there is a danger for backlash. And we need, in order to counter that, more institutions to be present and a more institutional approach, more how can I say, clarity, and more inclusion of more actors. And the concept of, I liked it very much, the mini publics, I liked it very much. And I think that this is something that we need to explore more. So thank you. We will come back to you in the round of questions. So let's go back to Mia, if we can see, let's try and open up. Yes. Okay. So I know that someone else will deliver your slides at your request. So Mia, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Well, mini publics, I like that a lot. It sort of links back to city-states, especially when it comes to the locality of issues that we're facing. It makes a lot of sense. Let me ask you, can you hear me okay? Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Okay, my presentation is entitled Journalism, Mediation and the Environment, and I'm going to give examples from the Arctic that I've been doing research about the last almost 15 years, and I would like to differentiate between journalism, media, and mediation, because there are different ways of mediation. Could we go to the next slide, please? The examples I'm going to give today and the issues that I'm going to mention are from my own research the past few years, current and recent. One is to do with media and mediation, fast and slow media, and I will get to these, corporate and independent media, global and local dimensions, extractive journalism, and additive journalism, which I will get back to at the end of my presentation. And of course, these all relate to publics and public spheres. And the examples that I'm going to use as the basis of my arguments here, of my discussion, come from one recent book, Arctic Geopolitics, Media and Power, that came out 2 years ago, and the other one being a special issue of Environmental Communication Journal that was entitled Environmental Themes in Popular Narratives, the ways in which environmental themes are popping up in different forms of media and mediation, not only in relation to journalism and journalistic coverage, but in this issue we covered anything from zombie apocalyptic narratives, that we see on Netflix, to rap music, which caters to a certain kind of youth, to other forms of mediation, popular mediation that deal with the environment. So it's not just news media anymore, obviously, increasingly so. Okay, next slide, please. As we know, there are loads of issues with environmental journalism. It goes without saying. We have event-driven coverage that we get to see about the environment and environmental disasters when it comes to certain weather events. It's been an issue since the 80s, and it continues to be an issue, actually. And this summer, again, after the forest fires a few years ago, last year in Australia, we got to see a lot about environmental issues. That doesn't mean the media are not covering issues related to the environment other than those times anymore. They are being more attentive to environmental issues, but nevertheless, it peaks during these times, and then it sort of dips again when issues are competing with each other. There are strong visual elements. Speaking of the importance of visuality and visual narratives, visual images, certain kind of images stick in the heads and minds of readers and audiences, such as birds being covered in oil after oil spills. Polar bears, of course, have been up there on the list, being used as very vivid and frequent sort of visual representations of what is happening to the environment. We have other issues such as 27 news cycle. That is, we don't have news anymore, just evening news and morning news and newspaper news, but we have news all the time, which means issues are competing with each other in terms of finding the space to make themselves out there. So that is also a very important factor. Next slide, please. We have the decline of traditional journalism in the West. Between 2007 and 2018, almost 50% of employees in big newspapers were laid off in the United States. So that's a factor. So when it comes to financial crises, of course, the first to go are environmental desks and cultural desks, and that has enormous consequences for the public. And what Jacob was talking about earlier about mini publics, it's very important, and that they don't get to hear news that was investigated by journalists who are knowledgeable and equipped to cover these kinds of issues. There are issues related with newsworthiness in relation to impact and scale of the news that the newspapers see as important, and they decide to cover these issues. There are editorial processes. There is gatekeeping. There are journalistic norms of objectivity and balance, and this affected the United States greatly, as we know, starting from very early on, but I mean, just going back to the 80s in relation to how they covered the issue of greenhouse effect. At the time, it was referred to as such. Global warming, climate change, as something that was divided amongst the scientific community, whereas it wasn't actually. The majority of the scientists were agreeing that there was human-caused climate change. There are framing, agenda-setting, fact and source checking, which is increasingly more and more important as an issue in the age of social media. Where are these news and information coming from? There is parachute journalism. That is these big news outlets sending a crew of a journalist, a photographer, etc., every other year or every 3 years to a remote region, such as the Arctic, since I'm talking about the Arctic from the point of view of my own research and covering it extensively. And then, the next 2 to 3 years, we don't really hear much about it. And we can multiply these issues, of course. There are lots of problems with journalistic coverage of these issues related to the environment, related to areas that are hard hit by climate change. And these relate to both political economy of the media and other issues, some of which I tried to list here. Next slide, please. And I also wanted to mention COVID-19 as added crisis, although it doesn't make justice to the issue. It's not just an added crisis, it is the crisis that we have been dealing with the last few years, the last 2 years. And it led to a great deal of discussion at the beginning of the crisis. If some of us would remember, saying, okay, we have reduced mobility, meaning maybe this will be helpful in terms of mitigation of emissions, right? Because we're flying less, etc. But at the same time, we were shopping a lot more online, and transportation is an issue, etc. And this, I think, is an important sort of a point of entry that I would like to link to the ways in which media, big media, that's what I'm trying to sort of get at, link this to individual responsibility. What is our individual responsibility here? Whereas the issues are much bigger, they are systemic, they're macro, and much bigger than what individuals can actually. Of course, this is not to suggest that it's not important, but nevertheless, I'm just talking about the ways in which the media pitch these issues. Next slide, please. This is just an overview of covering of the Arctic. And the reason why I'm giving the Arctic as an example here is not only because that I have been doing research about the Arctic almost 15 years from now, and the Arctic is not only a region in its own right. Obviously, the ice extent is decreasing, and there are 4 million people living in the Arctic Circle, but the Arctic is also the bellwether of climate change. The fact that the ice extent is decreasing has enormous consequences for the planet itself. So the ways in which it is covered is of extreme importance. In 2007, the satellite measurements showed for the first time that the ice was melting a lot faster than predicted by climate models. And then in 2012, we had like an even bigger sea ice minimum. That's what it's called, sea ice minimum, and that those made the headlines. And after 2007, we saw a lot of the Arctic and polar bears in the media. But in 2010, for instance, it sort of fell off the map. Then it sort of went up again. But when we look at the coverage the past few years, yes, we do see a lot more coverage. Again, these are just overview figures about the coverage of the Arctic. Next slide, please. And in relation to the Arctic and the climate, we see a lot more. No need to go into the figures here, since we have very limited time. Next slide, please. And we see a lot of coverage in relation to fossil fuels and energy. in one way or another, and it depends on the kind of newspaper or news outlet we're looking at in terms of the ways in which they cover these issues. Next slide, please. And we also still see a lot of coverage in relation to how you can help the climate this Earth Day, for instance, like what is your personal civic citizenship responsibility or consumer responsibility when it comes to the climate change. Next slide, please. So this, I think, boils down to what I'm trying to get at in relation to fast media and slow media and corporate media, independent media, and these sort of keywords I tried to mention at the beginning. If we have media, big media, dependent on advertising, and not only advertising, it's not just they are selling eyeballs to advertisers, which they are in the business of, but they are also promoting a certain kind of lifestyle. And I, over the years in my research about the Arctic, talked to a lot of journalists and editors in relation to how they choose to cover the Arctic, etc. This is an example, for instance, from a Jaguar ad showing a jaguar in the womb of a woman. So on the one hand, this is to point to an anomaly. On the one hand, we need to, the media need to cover issues related to oil consumption and the impact of big industry on the environment and on the lives of the citizens of this planet, of the inhabitants of this planet, not only citizens, but also non-human inhabitants of the planet. But on the other hand, we have a media that depends on income from the industry itself, right? In this case, a car company that caters to a very particular kind of consumer group in society. Next slide, please. So what I'm trying to get at here, fast media is what I'm talking about, referring to Harold Innes, actually the Canadian historian, when he wrote about empire and communications in the 1950s, time-based media versus space-based media, sort of a mixing it up with, like, you know, more current concepts. We could say we have fast media, fast and furious media, if you will, and slow media. Fast media meaning the news media, the television news, and social media, of course, nowadays that produces a lot of news, a lot of information. They're consumed very fast as well. And with slow media, I'm referring to, say, museum exhibitions or forms of art and artivism and murals, street art, etc., that also communicate information and messages to people. And I think those are also important nowadays, especially when it comes to younger audiences. And that was the reason why in that special journal issue for environmental communication, I chose to frame it as mediation, not just media, and looking at different forms such as popular music and rap music, etc. Next slide, please. So this boils down to the idea, I think, that media are power brokers. They're not just conveyors of information. They're not just conveyors of messages or speech acts, but they are power brokers in and of themselves because they are part of the business world. So it is very important for audiences to understand the media in these terms, but at the same time, we don't have that kind of media literacy. And I think it is a great event in the sense what you guys organized. It's about literacy. Are we there yet? Do we have? Yes, we do. In many ways, many audiences, audience members realize that it is the case. But at the same time, there are many others who don't think about it like that. And we're talking about an extremely crucial issue that is supreme importance to the planet, not only to us as human species, but to all species of this planet. Next slide, please. These are just some examples from a relatively recent event, Standing Rock protests in the United States that was started by indigenous peoples in relation to the land that they were living in, and Greta Thunberg was there supporting the event. And what we see from, again, going back to what I said about visuals and the ways in which issues are framed in media, what we see is we see these people who are at the center of this movement that are indigenous people from there behind, but Greta Thunberg is there. Is this necessarily bad? No, okay, this draws attention. Maybe it gets more coverage in the media, but nevertheless, the media operate in a very certain way. And that this is I'm showing this as an example of an event or incident that sort of showcases this. If you could go to the next slide, please. And this is another example. I looked at so many pictures, and it's hard to find the pictures where you see the Native Americans from the face, but and the other way around. It's almost always this way around. Next slide, please. And this is another example. This was 2020 World Economic Forum in Davos. And Greta Thunberg and a number of other young activists were there protesting and trying to get their voices heard. And Associated Press, and considering that budgets were cut down for many environmental desks at newspapers, a lot of newspapers, including local newspapers, are getting their news from wire services. And this is a wire service, Associated Press. And they chose to cut the Ugandan young protester in their picture, trying to make Greta Thunberg sort of more center stage. I'm not trying to suggest that big media are never doing a good job. Of course, there are many instances that they are doing a good job. But nevertheless, there are many instances like this as well. And after this, they apologized and they published the original picture. And why is this happening? Because those old sort of norms and routines and processes are still there, very much dominating the scene. And this is the kind of news that audiences, readers are getting. And does this matter? It absolutely does matter. Next slide, please. So where does this leave us? There are alternative means of mediation and communication. In places like the Arctic, we are getting more fiber optic lines and more connectivity, and that means we can get more news and information from the site by people who live there. And that can lead to more sort of independent media reportage, publications, different forms of mediation that maybe we were not used to before, when we entirely depended on mass communication and mass communication channels. Next slide, please. On the downside, this is not to glorify, of course, alternative media, media that sort of stand on the other side of the issue, that propagate that there is no human-caused climate change. They are also very active. There's also greenwashing and communication that sort of downplays the importance of climate change and the human factor in that is also an issue. But what I'm trying to draw attention to here is the fact that this leaves people with an enormous responsibility, that they as audiences, as readers, as users of media, they need to be able to filter this information and understand where they come from, the information, and they need to be able to relate to the sources. They need to be able to fact checking. And is this fair after all? That might be one question that comes out of this panel, perhaps, and I can sort of leave it up in the air. But if we go to the next slide, please. This is my last slide. And this is from a very short piece by this person, Alison Axton. She was a journalist. Now she calls herself a storyteller, and she uses the works of artists in communities to recenter, as she puts it, narratives. And she says, whereas Western journalism practices can be extractive in nature, and that's what I was referring to at the beginning of my presentation, extractive versus additive journalism, collaborative storytelling initiatives aim to be additive. Co-production in the news context has the potential not only to improve the vividness and efficacy coverage of the Arctic, but to serve, and of course this goes for any other region, but to serve as a capacity building tool for participants and their communities. So we can use other forms of storytelling and other forms of mediation to get the stories from the source, from the site, out there. And it's not only journalism anymore. Of course, we also have been depending on documentary filmmaking for quite some time now. But there have been quite a few studies actually looking at, I'm not going to name them, but big sort of TV channels, nature channels, who do a lot of sensationalist editing, meaning they edit it for sensationalism, but therefore accuracy of the information is compromised. So that's, I think, next slide, please, where I would like to leave us, and thank you for listening.
Keep as you know, as points the difference that you mentioned, that we are focused on events, and that the media are event driven, that we have a tendency towards the dramatic, and then there is silence, there is no follow-up. We just have a dramatic news, and then we don't know what happened before and what led to the event and what happens after the event. So we see an event and no follow-up. The discussion on declining of traditional journalism is very important, and the effects of the crisis on news desks, mainly on environmental desks, but also cultural, etc., etc. It was also very, very interesting. The role of the pandemic and how the discussion has a bit deviated because of the pandemic. We saw positive things without actually considering the context, and we presented just numbers without explaining and without portraying the reality. And then, of course, the link between climate and international and national politics, and how the issues affect or are affected by international and national politics, and how do you portray this news to your benefit, or through a lens that has a very distorted view, that gives a very distorted view of the same events. So we can circle back to your points. Thank you, Miyaza, very much for your presentation. We will go now to Theodota Nansu, and she will do a presentation on how to advocate for the planet in time of crisis. Theodota, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Lefteri. Thank you for the invitation. I will share a few slides now in order to make my otherwise boring speech more interesting, I hope. So one of the biggest challenges that civil society is facing is how to advocate, how to communicate sometimes difficult scientific concepts and data, hard data on the condition of the planet, on the climate crisis, on the loss of biodiversity, especially during times of crisis. In Greece, during the past, say, decade, we have been facing an economic crisis that has hit the country hard and has had a really detrimental cost on society. We are also now facing the pandemic, the crisis of COVID-19. So the question remains, how do we communicate the sneaky and it's a matter of, you know, life and death. How do you communicate the climate crisis that is already here, that is already impacting both Greece and the whole world? And how do you persuade people that there are solutions and we all need to act together? So one of the greatest challenges is, how do you get the scientific data that can be boring or difficult to grasp and difficult to understand and, you know, difficult to allow you to get the big picture of what is happening, and transform these into a narrative that is both scientifically sound, and that has to be at the forefront of everything that we do, but is also persuasive and clear and allows people to relate to this really hard reality of climate change. One of the big rules that we need to always keep in mind is, so to speak, the KISS principle. Keep it short and simple. We cannot just, you know, bombard people with hard data and hard science that does not allow them to relate to what is happening and really understand what this crisis is all about. So change happens in the deep brain. How do we manage to affect people and make them feel that what is really going on is indeed a matter of life and death that will impact societies not in 2050, but today? It is already impacting us today. And especially during times of economic and social crisis, as Jacob said, it's the end of the world versus the end of the week. So people struggle to make ends meet. People struggle to, you know, have a life. How do you persuade them that what is already happening, but maybe in a more subtle pace, in a slower pace, like the climate crisis, is really having an impact on everyday life? So I will focus on two, say, case studies. One has to do with what we did, how we tried to communicate environment during the time, that the decade of the economic crisis in Greece, 9 years of the economic crisis. And secondly, I will talk about the climate crisis, communicating the climate crisis in these difficult times. So during the decade of the economic crisis, that is since 2010 until late 2019, we knew as civil society that environment would go into the backseat, into the back burner, and would face attacks, because what does Greece have? Beaches, forests. The message that we were getting was that, you know, these would be attacked, as in sell them and get money, save the economy by selling Greece's beautiful and, you know, rich natural resources and coasts and everything. So we needed to communicate to people and get them to get actively involved in saving what is left of Greece's nature and Europe's biodiversity. So that was a tricky thing to deal with, because during these years, you know, the whole political regime, the whole political spectrum in Greece, the debate, the discourse was highly partisan. So it was very heated, and we needed to start communicating in not a different language, but a more non-partisan language that would not allow anybody to say that, you know, WWF or you are taking one side or the other. We had to build trust. People need to know that we know what we're talking about. We know the science, we know the laws, and we try to communicate and make people relate to what solutions are out there. See the crisis, see that this needs to be addressed right now, see that saving Greece's coasts is about saving, the future of Greece, but there are solutions, and economy in Greece can, thrive without destroying what is left of Greece's environment. We also had to relate with what is happening today. People were struggling. How does this relate to what I am going through? And of course, you need to give hope that action works. So one of the worst attacks that we had to experience during different stages of this whole economic crisis period was repeated attacks against protective legislation for Greece's environment, particularly coasts and forests. So we had to deal with sometimes difficult to translate into, publicly understandable language, legal modifications, legal amendments, new laws that would allow big infrastructure and big projects and big constructions to be located on fragile coastal ecosystems, or illegal buildings to be legalized in valuable forest land. We needed to stop that. So we had to communicate in a very simple language and, bring people closer to what is happening out there. This is one of the ads that we published in social media, that this beautiful landscape is for sale. No, it cannot be for sale. We cannot allow this legislation to change. And this is not what's going to save Greece's economy. So that is one of the, say, major campaigns that we had to go through 3 times during the economic crisis. We tried to avoid a rollback, a massive rollback on legislation protecting Greece's coastline. And actually, we were very successful in mobilizing people, because I think that people never lost the interest, the care for Greece's environment, and they were just waiting for someone to mobilize them. And this is what we are seeing in the case of the climate crisis as well. So whereas we did not accept, how can I say, we did not think that anybody would act massively, anybody would act in stopping this massive rollback and, repeated attacks on Greece's environmental legislation, we managed to get many, many, many thousands of people to join forces in different ways. And we managed to hold many incidents of rollback on Greece's coastal legislation, same with forest legislation, same with coal, new coal plants. That has been quite successful, and we're really proud to. We were really proud to see not just the wins, but people under these difficult circumstances for the whole of Greece, showing an active interest in finding different solutions. To mobilizing forces that will save, that will get Greece out of this economic crisis. This is an example, this slide shows an example of how we modified, the narrative. We didn't want to talk about green economy. This term has been hijacked by many political parties and is quite loaded. We did not want to talk about sustainable economy. Who really understands what sustainable means? So we tried talking about living economy, and that resonated, that allowed people to relate living economy versus, Greece's dying economy. So we managed to get people more actively involved, politicians as well, to listen to the proposals that we had to, that we wanted to communicate. The climate crisis is the second example, and I will leave it at that. This is really tough to communicate. How do you communicate, for example, in Greece or any other country, that the whole planet, that the climate of the whole planet is changing? Who is to blame? Is it Greece to blame? Many people in Greece say, no, it's not Greece to blame. It's the United States, it's China, it's UK. Why should Greece which is, a poor country, phase out coal before the United States or before Germany or whatever. So you need to start communicating this hard science that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, writes in these difficult to read reports. Okay, who can read the reports of the IPCC? You need to bring it to everyday life and make people understand that there's no China or US or Greece in this. We all absolutely need to act together, of course, with effort sharing and just rules. But Greece is a member of the European Union, and we all need to be together in this. And there are many opportunities for, climate innovation and everything, but we need to be together in this, because the climate crisis is a matter of life and death, and Greece is already experiencing really, really, really detrimental impacts of climate change. So we need to connect with science. We need to connect people with the hard science of climate change. We need to build trust. And when we see climate denialism, same goes with other forms of denial of science, we think it's a matter of trust. There's a lack of trust in politicians, in the system, in even scientists, in NGOs, in whoever lives next door. So you need to build trust. And you always need to be frank about what you're saying. You never cheat people about, the basics of climate science. You remain firm in your messaging and everything, everything that builds this narrative. We highlight social justice because there's going to be, tremendous changes in the system as we try to approach climate neutrality. And of course, we need to show that climate action works, and especially with climate change, the climate crisis, which is not, it's not, it does not appear to relate to everybody in our daily lives. Change needs a face, and although we saw a slowdown of global policies on climate change between Paris and Glasgow, or even more between Copenhagen 2009 and Paris and then Glasgow. When this phase, Greta Thunberg, came into play, we saw that everybody, especially the young generation, younger people, were just waiting for someone to take the lead. It's not that they were indifferent. Maybe many people were disappointed, but it's as if everybody waits for someone to take the lead. So when Greta Thunberg came to the fore, there were massive, actions and demonstrations and, Fridays for Future, and, people were motivated to start taking action. So the challenge is always there. How do you translate the hard facts, scientific data into everyday messages and, engaging narratives? Last slide is an example of what we tried to do in Greece. We drafted a national climate law. Everybody needs climate legislation. All countries, not just Greece. So what we did is that we drafted a people-centered, people-powered climate law. We placed it into public consultation, and now it's there. And the government seems to be listening to this, and we had a lot of participation by citizens in drafting and co-drafting and feeling that we are all part of this. And, this is collaborative policy making that made people feel part of the solution. And I think, and this is the last thing that I'm going to say, is you need to make people part of the solution. We need the climate crisis to get us all out of this, matter of life and death, as a stronger society, deeper and stronger democracy. Thank you, and I'll wait for questions.
Thank you, Theodota. I'm keeping the keep it short and simple principle, of course. I'm keeping the words that you use: trust, relate with today, link to the economy and the reality. I think that Jacob mentioned it. How do you link the end of the world to the end of the week? And then how do you present alternative and simple messages that can be that people can relate to? And how do you link the national concerns with the global concerns? And how do you present and you make it a global discussion? Our last speaker is James, and he will talk about how to communicate the climate crisis via the media. We are waiting for your presentation. James, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you very much for the other presentations. I would love to discuss those more, as even though I specialize in the media, I also teach effective communication. So some of the things that Theodota in particular was saying were really interesting. But I'm going to just, as I say, talk about the media. If I can just get this presentation up. It's indicating that it's loading, so I will wait just a second. If it doesn't, I think the organizers have got a backup copy. Okay, here we go. Okay, sorry about that delay. So I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to concentrate on the media coverage of communicating the climate crisis, partly because this is what I research most, but it's also the case that media is still by far the most common way that in general publics in most countries get their information about the climate crisis. So I hope you can see this chart all right. This shows that this was based on a survey that we did in 2020 in 40 countries, including the UK, including Greece, and many other developing countries, or many developing countries as well. And the top line is that television is by far the most important source of information in most societies by some margin. And that includes what Mia was talking about, TV documentaries as well as TV news. And I think what's interesting is if you look down the chart, printed newspapers are, as you would expect, becoming more and more marginal. But social media are still, even though they're important, they're nothing like as important as television and online news sites. So, you know, if we really want to get to grips with how people are receiving information about the climate emergency, we still have to look at mainstream media. Alternative media that Mia talks about are wonderful and they have a very important role to play, but it is still mainstream media that is very, very dominant. The next slide shows that, if it's coming, yeah, the next slide shows that there are important differences between the age demographics, and the older you are, the more television you watch, and the younger you are, you obviously depend more on social media. But the key fact is that it is still, even for young generation or younger generations, it is still mainstream media that are used considerably. If you want to find out more information, and including the information broken down by countries, then do go look at the Reuters Institute report, Digital News Report 2020. I didn't actually write it, so I'm allowed to promote it. This is actually what Mia was talking about in somewhat more detail, and because she went into it, I won't talk about it a lot. But the chair also mentioned it. The context in which journalism takes place is now very dynamic. It's changing a lot. I think Mia mentioned the collapse of the business model as digital advertising revenue goes to YouTube, Google, and Facebook. There's really interesting changes in the way that journalists see their role when they're reporting climate change. There's some evidence that more and more see them as advocates in the soft sense of that word. And of course, their relationship with sources are changing. But the reference is there. It goes into a lot more detail of how the media landscape is changing the way climate change is getting reported in different countries because of these tectonic shifts that are going on due to various societal and economic drivers. However, I would say that it's not a universally bleak picture, which I'm going to talk about very briefly in a minute. So these were the two questions that the organizers of this conference wanted us to focus on, and I'm going to very quickly, into the next 5 minutes, just talk about them. How do we ensure there's a well-informed citizenry? And I'm going to focus on the second question in a very normative way. How do we ensure media make a positive contribution? I think the first thing to say is a lot of environmental activist groups are forever complaining that the media, and I know that the media is a catch-all phrase, but here I'm really talking about legacy media or mainstream media, that they don't cover the climate change issue enough. I've been involved in many debates with Extinction Rebellion and others saying, you know, if only the BBC covered it more, if only the media in other countries covered it more, we would be in a much better position. I don't think that's the case, and you can shoot me down later. I think actually the volume of coverage, as this chart shows from Max Boykoff and his team at Colorado, actually it's particularly in recent, pre-COVID, there was historically high volumes of coverage in most countries. And then, of course, it shot up with the Glasgow COP. I don't think that volume of coverage, it would be a help, but I don't think it's the essential problem that's facing us right now when we think about climate journalism. To back up my point, I'm sorry this is mostly UK focused, but if you look at the top left, there's, for the first time ever on Sky News, there's a daily climate show. For the first time ever, the BBC have their own climate editor, and a number of media organisations, the BBC, have also appointed new climate correspondents or editors. There's an initiative, top right-hand corner, called Covering Climate Now, which is coordinated out of the United States, but has more than 450 outlets in several countries. Even in the UK media, where there's been a tradition in the right-wing press of being very denialist about the science, there is some signs that that is changing, although I will speak of a caveat to that. So actually, you know, the amount of media organizations taking climate change seriously, at least in the UK, and I think in parts of the US, it's not so much driven by events as what Mia and Leftaris were talking about. I think there is more consistency of coverage. There should be much more follow-up of certain events, but actually the volume of coverage and the consistency of coverage in the last couple of years, I would say, has been quite a significant shift. In terms of what they can do better, I don't think it's an issue so much as volume. I think it's the quality of the coverage and the emphasis of the coverage and the way that climate is framed that we really have to discuss and think about. This is an article that myself and a colleague wrote for Neiman Reports last year. It was called 5 Tips for Better Coverage. It wasn't meant to be that normative. It was just meant to throw out some issues which journalists and anyone in the world of communicating climate should think about. And the 5 areas we talked about were first, making it relevant to everyday life. It's rather what linked to Theodota. It's a similar point with saying that how do we make climate change more relevant to everybody's life. And the example of extreme weather events is a particularly useful example. We're doing a lot of research on that in terms of making the link, and perhaps we can talk briefly about that in discussion. The second point was, how do you move the climate story out of it being an environmental story, out of the environmental beat, and bring in finance journalists, health journalists, sports journalists into covering it in the same way that those different beats covered COVID. And that is changing, certainly changing in the BBC, but it can be, a lot more can be done. The third point is what, again, several of the previous speakers have mentioned, the emphasis on solutions. There's an awful lot of research on social psychology and the literature around how an emphasis on doom and gloom in climate reporting is not particularly conducive to people taking action and inspiring people to take action. Of course, there are lots of nuances, but there is a consensus that it would be immensely helpful if journalism really tried to talk more and give more inspiring stories about people taking control of their communities and doing something to counter the effects of climate change or adapting to them. The fourth, which again several speakers have mentioned, is emphasizing the visual, and the fifth is making it local. You know, so I think in many countries it's a real problem. How do you make these really big global level climate change science and events really relevant to people's lives at the local level? And with the decline of local newspapers and local media in many countries because of the crisis in the economic model, that is a real challenge, and it becomes very difficult. So moving quickly on, this is an example from the Covering Climate initiative about how journalists are trying to, in some countries anyway, cover the solutions angle much more, with much more nuance and quality. Here is Climate Visuals. If you don't know it, it's an initiative coordinated by Climate Outreach here in Oxford. Do go and look it up. And it's about really investigating the effect of certain photographs about climate change on different audience segmentation. And for example, in the case of extreme heat waves, you know, how can we have a more responsible array of photographs to illustrate the fact that actually heat waves can be a terrible killer even in Western European societies, and yet most of the photos that accompany it are often people having a great time in a heat wave in fountains or in the sea or having ice creams. Fourth point, I think this is a really, really interesting article, and I really would recommend that you look at it. It's not written by me, it's written by a colleague at the Reuters Institute called Wolfgang Blau, who is trying to summarize the implications and the lessons for journalists from reporting on COVID, and which of those experiences in big newsrooms in particular are helpful to try to get better reporting of the climate crisis. What have we learned as journalists and as media and as academics from the reporting of COVID that can be transferred to the climate crisis? So he's made about 5 points. I'll mention 2 or 3. One is interdisciplinarity. With the COVID crisis, the science journalists who were covering it and the health journalists were constantly working with journalists from other beats to make the story more compelling. How can journalists effectively and regularly and in an attractive and engaging way give people information about COVID that can then be executed and analyzed at the, and followed at the local level? How do you report on uncertainty in a responsible way? How do you report on the science in a way that people understand? There's some really rich, interesting examples of how COVID can help, even though, of course, some of the parallels between COVID and climate change are very different. If you are interested, if there are any journalists out there at this conference, then there's a new initiative launched by my colleagues at the Reuters Institute on the Climate Journalism Network, precisely looking at how we can get climate journalism to take on some of these issues that I've just mentioned in a more responsible way. Do look it up. And then finally, I think Jacob mentioned it. This is a really important issue for those countries where there has been a strong tradition of denialism. I think we have to be really careful and clear that the type of climate denialism put forward by right-wing politicians and right-wing lobby groups in countries like the USA, the UK, Australia, but in some Western European countries as well, is changing. There's much more contestation now around the policy responses, i.e., what we should do about it, compared to the science. And so we should be really careful as journalists and academics to try and identify these new-ish discourses that can be anything. I think Jacob mentioned it's too costly. Why should we do anything when China and India are not? Or why should poor people suffer when richer people are able to adapt better? So these are some of the issues that are being discussed both in the practical world of journalism and some of the research that myself and other colleagues are doing. But I think the big picture and the big discussion point, I think, are two. One is, how is this changing media landscapes affecting climate coverage, and what can journalists do about it? And I think the other, the really rich material is, what have journalists learned from the COVID crisis that translates to reporting in a more engaging, responsible and mature way about the climate crisis? And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, James. I'm keeping as points the initial slides that you saw, the predominant role of TV in the presentation of climate news, but also the gap in generations on what type of media people use depending on their age and the way that they receive the information on climate, and the comparison between volume and quality, which is very important. It's not the volume that is a problem, but the quality of the reporting that we need to discuss. And we can connect it also to your last point on the discourses, on how do we manage the new discourses and how do we adapt to these new discourses. And all of your points and the examples that you gave, I think, were very relevant. And I'm very, very happy because all of your presentations were connected. And this is something very useful for a moderator. And we could stop here because all of your points were interconnected. But we have some questions and some points and that people would like to come back to. So I have a very specific question for Theodota. A previous speaker on the first panel presented the role of comics on how to use comics to do a bit of advocacy or to present policy, etc. So do you think that in your presentation comics could have an important role or not? Very specific question for you, and then we'll come back to the others.
The reply could be an absolutely yes, Lefteris, just as simple as that. However, it's always, a difficult mind game. How do you translate these complex laws, complex scientific data, complex reality into simple comics? So we need the best minds we can get that, can translate even these complex realities into, and put in practice the KISS principle, and translate them into something that people can relate to and see it in, simple pictures. It's always a difficult game, but absolutely comics have a central and need to have a central part in communicating and advocating for the environmental crisis.
Okay, thank you. I would like to make a question to all of you, and if you could be very brief on that. In all of your presentations, we saw that there is a gap in the generations on how they perceive the issues, on how they want to be informed about the climate change, etc. Do you believe that what Theodota demonstrated with the role of Greta, and someone else also mentioned Greta, I think Mia, on how this phase of the crisis is enough? Is Fridays for Future enough? Could we cover the whole thing by just one phase? And is this enough to present a concise narrative, a convincing story, and how to that could have an effect on people. Jacob, let's start with you. Yeah, and yeah, James, you will answer too, of course.
Yeah, no, happy to go first. So I guess two things on that. One, well, no is probably my answer, and I think there's different ways of coding this issue that work well for people with different kind of priors and worldviews and backgrounds. And there is a particular way of presenting it that kind of goes along with the Greta Thunberg narrative that speaks to a part of the population. It doesn't speak to others. So I think there's that issue. But the second issue is that certainly in places like the UK that have moved from a sort of science denialism into a what do we do denialism, I think we need more and more to sort of fragment when we talk about the climate issue. We need to start speaking quite specifically about housing decarbonisation, transport decarbonisation, etc. So less and less does it make sense. It's needed, sure, but less and less can we kind of get to where we need to go with just kind of one message and one movement, if you like.
Okay, Mia.
I think I very much agree.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I very much agree with Jacob. If you base an answer to that on what the research tells you, the social science research, the first one is you need multiple narratives for multiple audiences. There's a huge amount of research now on audience segmentation and what sort of messaging around the climate crisis works for different audiences. I really recommend a new-ish article that was published in Nature Climate Change, Goldberg et al., about how different Republican voices appeal to different Republican segments, business segment, evangelical segment, army and politicians. And it is really very, very convincing. So that's point number one. I think Jacob's exactly right. And the only thing I would add is on the Greta question, again, there's a lot of research showing trusted messengers are really, really important. And so for an audience that is going to be well disposed, a youth audience who are very concerned and want to be active, Greta Thunberg is an ideal vehicle. If you put I don't know how many of you watch Fox News, but if Fox News deliberately put up pictures of Greta Thunberg to annoy their audience. So, it's you've got to really think, who are the trusted messengers for different audiences. And as Jacob says, what is the discourse that you're now trying to put forward? Is it the science, as Theodota said, or is it actually, we actually have to think more and more and more now about action and solutions, which is what I would suggest.
Thank you for that. Mia?
Yes, thank you. I think I would like to mention a few things. Starting 2018 in the UK as well, starting with The Guardian, they switched to using keywords such as climate crisis, climate emergency, even though previous studies were thought to be alarmist discourses. I think there is also the issue that we're getting to a certain point where there were certain events that happened in the UK that led to that, but I will not get into that. So that's one important point. The second is in relation to gloom and loom. I mentioned that in my presentation as well, like that sort of rubbing audiences and readers in the wrong way. But at the same time, we have a increasingly more fragmented audience right now due to social media. Well, but what kind of questions does that raise? I'm not going to try to give an answer to that, but I would like to put that as a question out there. And the third is, it's not just Fox News, but I showed that as an example in my presentation, Associated Press, where, I did a study about the coverage of COP25 in Nordic newspapers in Sweden, in the Arctic Circle, and the issue obviously concerns them greatly, the climate change issue, and they were getting their news from wire services because they didn't have the resources to hire journalists to cover the issue. So if a news organization, if a news wire organization, wire service like Associated Press is cutting away a Ugandan young activist, so it's not that it's only Greta Thunberg, but they are there. But if big wire services are doing this, then where does this leave us? It's not just Fox News, obviously.
Theodota?
I think that we need people of all ages and all sexes and all social backgrounds to become iconic you know, climate heroes or climate ambassadors. I mean, Greta has a clean face. She's young. She's the next generation, but not all people can relate with this person and this model. So, for example, some years ago, 2 years ago in the UK, there was this 91-year-old grandfather who was arrested during climate protests. Give him a face. I mean, he's a climate hero. And there was another man, 63-year-old granddad, that's what he said, that who is fighting for his grandchildren's future. Give them a face, give them a voice. There are poor people that will suffer and they do not have a voice. So make them iconic. Allow people to relate to all people of different backgrounds, social backgrounds, colors, you know, countries. We need to give these people a voice. It's not just Greta. She started the movement. She made young people relate to what is happening. She gave the climate crisis a real voice, but it's not just her. We should not stop with Greta.
Okay, I'm very conscious of time, but I would like to ask a last question, and I would ask you to be very, very brief. It's something I think that Jacob brought up in his presentation about how the lack of time, meaning that there is an emergency, gives the excuse to states to limit the discussion and make it a very closed one without involving or including others. Do you have a proposal on how to counter that? Jacob, of course, has a proposal because it's the thing that he works on. But I would like to also to hear the others. So, Jacob, I will start with you since you brought up the issue. How we can tackle that? How do you stop using the emergency as an excuse to limit the scope of the discussion or to exclude people from the discussion?
Yeah, I'll say a few things on that. I mean, one thing, I think the answer to that is contextual. You have to look at what political institutions and traditions exist in the place that you are working, and that's your basis for operation from, which is why I don't find the sort of eco-authoritarian argument even that compelling as a realistic future in a UK context. It seems to me just a kind of technocratic dream. So that's the first thing I'd say. And working within the UK context, for example, you know, we have a legacy of representative institutions that are there to bring people's voices into these debates. So take them as your starting point, work out how to make them work better and how to bring people's voices into those and form movements to kind of get those changes to happen and embed those institutional changes. But I think that I won't go into sort of the details on that, but I think being attuned to the context that you're working in is a really important part of answering that question.
Okay, James?
Yeah, I mean, it's not my area of expertise, it's Jacob's, but the only thing I would say is I think you do have to think quite hard about how you introduce discourses and narratives that appeal to a wider audience than those people in the NGO sector or sympathize with the NGO sector. How do you put forward a discourse and a narrative that appeals to right-wing and right-leaning audiences in terms of whatever it is, economic security or future generations? Again, there's some great work being done by Climate Outreach on this, but to me, we're not going to get this unless we bring as many people as long as possible from different political leanings, and that would be my approach.
Mia?
Yes, I mean, we live in the age of narrowcasting. Broadcasting, yes, of course, TV is still important, but then again, it seems to be, it remains to be seen to what extent different generations and different locales, different countries, even different cities of the same country are getting their news from television and radio. Not to suggest it's not, absolutely, it is very important. But nevertheless, we have a very fragmented, very divided media ecology, media landscape. And of course, it takes a lot of research, a lot of dedicated work to figure out how we communicate what's going on to different audience segments. It's not as straightforward as it used to be. Not that it was ever straightforward, but it's not, perhaps it's more difficult now than it used to be, say, 20, 30, 50 years ago.
Thank you. Ferdota?
The truth is that as we approach the 1.5 degrees global warming, things will get more urgent. So there's going to be crisis, and there's going to be, you know, the narrative that we need to do things now, and who cares about public consultation or democratic whatever. So it is absolutely essential that we raise the flag of climate democracy. We need to get out of this crisis better as a society. We need to get out of this together. So transparency, public engagement, meaningful public engagement, and consultations on policy and decision making. I mean, climate sets the bar. We're not going to discuss whether there is a climate crisis happening or not, but the solutions we need to decide together. This is what say civil society needs to raise as flag, and we need to persuade governments that we need deep change, and deep change can only happen when we are all together in this.
Thank you. I will use my capacity as a moderator to add to that we have examples on how the narrative on emergency is being used. We saw it with the refugee crisis. We are still 6 years after in an emergency mode, and we are not discussing about policies. We just say that it is an emergency, and we implement measures without consultation. And the same is happening for the moment, although we are in an emergency, with the pandemic. So you have I think that James mentioned the parallels between the presentations that you do and the discourses, the pandemic. I would add the refugee reality and also the climate crisis. So I have to stop here. So I would like to thank all of you. I would like to thank the organizers, the University of Bournemouth and About People for this tremendous opportunity to listen to you. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, James. Thank you, Mia. Thank you, Theodota. Thank you to all of you for watching us. We will stop here, and hopefully we will find ways to communicate with another opportunity. Thank you again very much to all.
Thank you.
Thank you.